Welcome to Trinity Radio. I'm Braxton Hunter, and you found the Christian channel that loves atheists. And today, unfortunately, we don't have an atheist live and in studio to talk to, but we do have Caleb Jackson. Caleb Jackson is well known to theology geeks and perhaps atheists and agnostics who watch this kind of content because he's been on Capturing Christianity and he's been on all the other big shows talking often about miracles, but recently talking about miracles in a debate where he and Jimmy Akin faced off against John Loftus and another atheist who's
Darren Slade.
What is it?
Darren Slade.
Darren Slade.
Yeah.
So anyway, Caleb, welcome to the show. I'm so glad you're here.
Thanks, Braxton. I appreciate it. We're in the studio together, but having to look over.
Yeah, and in fact, I should just go ahead and say, now, I fixed it so everyone can see now, Caleb. When I look that way, I'm looking right at Caleb. When he looks this way, he's looking right at me. This is how it's set up for me and Jonathan. So if the first time you've seen this, we're actually in the same room. That's why that's happening. So feel free at any point to look at me or the camera. Doesn't matter. And today, he drove down from Indianapolis, where he lives, to hang out with me, go to church with me. We worshiped together and went out to eat together. And now here we are, and we're going to talk about Caleb's story. How did he get to the point he's at now, where he often brings up the miraculous and other issues to make a case for the truth of Christianity. Caleb, so let's just jump right into this. You don't have an active YouTube channel right now. Is that right?
Yeah, that is correct. So typically I'm more of an author. So I do have a few books, and I have a large book on miracles that I'm currently writing. But I do go on other people's channels, and I consider myself as a theological hobbyist. So I right off the bat say I don't have any particular training. I don't have any degrees. I don't even have a YouTube channel. But I have lots of friends, including Braxton, who have connections. And this is, I think, how just over the years you get to learn about this and to really develop yourself in that way. So I consider my art form to be literature and writing more so than videography. But I'm always happy to take opportunity of video when it's there.
Well said. And so what we're going to do, though, is you do have a microphone. And if I could get you to scoot just a little closer to that mic, that would be great for the editing. And that will make him much larger on the screen. But trust me, I am much larger and he is much more in shape. But in any case, let's just start from the beginning. I was asking you at lunch, Caleb, you were raised in a Christian family, you said. But at some point, you kind of started to move away from some of the stuff you'd been given in Christian school in terms of doctrinal stuff. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I was raised in a pretty traditional Christian household with great, loving parents. They still are, in that way, still are very, very close to. Very grateful to have been raised in that environment and to have people who were really positively involved in my life. But I went to a private Christian school back in Louisville, Kentucky, where I was originally from. And I kind of was raised with pretty traditional views in that sense. So while it wasn't explicitly taught in the household or my church, the school did emphasize things like young earth creationism and Calvinism and these more quote-unquote fundamentalist doctrines that you might see in churches like that. So that was the Christianity that I was familiar with for probably up until senior year of high school. And then around that time, probably senior year of high school, going into freshman year of college, is when I had, as cliched of a word as I use, the deconstruction period, right? Where I never full out left the faith, but I had the points where I was really doubting myself and doubting what I believed was true. And I saw lots of what people in the philosophical community call defeaters in terms of, oh, maybe this isn't true. Which parts of this? How do I make my faith my own? And I'm not just having it be contingent on the faith of my parents. So I wanted to come up with something that was more personal to me and to take on my own faith journey in that sense.
And I should jump in, Caleb, here to say that we've said on the show a lot that this, what we now call deconstruction and with a goal toward deconversion for some people, used to be just what we would call thinking through your worldview in your early 20s. And it's a common thing that people did. Now it's got a name. And for some people, it almost has a flavor of, if you're deconstructing, we would expect you're deconstructing in a certain trajectory out of some form of Christianity. But you didn't do that. You just said, I'm going to take this stuff apart and put it back together and see what holds water. And I did that too. And you changed on some issues. And I think a lot, Caleb, about deconversion stories I hear at this point. And it's at this point where some atheists and agnostics, when they discovered that maybe, even just maybe, or for some of them, it seems likely that this view I was raised with in Christian school or at home or in church was false, then they just to make a hard line toward atheism and agnosticism. That's not what happened to you. Why were you able to stay in the faith in the midst of that?
Yeah, no, that's a question that I continually think about in terms of how could it have been different in that way. But I kind of went into college not identify. I still identified as a Christian, but was much more cynical and was much more raising questions, sort of trying to get people to look at things like, oh, did you know the Old Testament talks about genocide and chattel slavery and stuff like that you'll hear from a lot of people say, and just a very cynical view where I felt like if there was a God, he didn't care about me or wasn't overly involved in my life. And part of that was because building community, I think, in high school and other ones was always hard. I did have a clique of friends and niche like that, but whenever you move different spaces in life, especially going from high school to college, you kind of lose all of those familiarities and have a new network of people you have to get used to. You have to meet people and all that stuff. So I was never overly social and had a strong sense of community after coming up high school. So I think part of that led to that decline and that almost nihilistic perception of my life not really mattering. And so that got me into questions about, like, does God exist? Does God care about me? Or am I just going to live my life, die, and then have nothing happen? So it was very, for that reason, emotionally painful and something that I tortured myself with through mentally for a while, and including causing harm to myself, both spiritually and even physically. It's not something that I share a lot. But it was a very dark period in my life. And while I would never say that I was like flat out suicidal in that sense, I certainly did have those like fantasies about, what would it look like if at my funeral or something like that in that way. So it was a very dark place to be at mentally, and I think I first sort of got out of that when I found Christian communities within the college I was going to. And so that helped, but I wasn't intellectually there. I kind of was like, okay, God, I don't know what the answer to this is, but I'm going to rely on you. In fact, one of the most prominent experiences, not that I use the term like as anything overly extraordinary, that I can recall was probably, I want to say this was probably sophomore year of college, where I was first starting to get into looking into biblical scholarship and I, not necessarily apologetics in that way. And so I was trying to defend the whole Bible, and I was trying to say, okay, why is the Bible inspired by God? And my first inclination was, prophecy, right? So I spent a lot of time looking at Isaiah and Daniel. And if you know anything about those, there's a lot of scholarship that's very complicated and goes a lot of ways. But long story short, I had a lot of doubts about whether Daniel was authentic or not, and whether these were prophecies. And I just felt so overwhelmed by every argument having a counter argument that I just remember getting on my knees. And this was I remember this distinctly. I was working out at the in my home gym at the time, and just could not even get through the workout because my thoughts about it were bothering me so much that it actually interfered with that. So I got on my knees and was just like, God, I don't know what the answer is to any of this, but I just need you to help me out and do that. And I just feel this enamorate sense of peace come over me, and it was like that, the second I say that. And that's to me what it was. It wasn't an audible voice, but it was giving the sensation that hey, I don't know what the answer is, but I know that it's going to be okay. I don't know why that's the case, but I just know down the road I'm going to be okay in that sense. So I don't tout that as any particularly powerful piece of evidence. That's not the reason I am a Christian. You could explain that through psychological expectation, absolutely.
Does it count for something to you personally?
I think in the moment it did. Yeah, I think at the time it did.
I'll tell you why I asked that. People who've listened to the show for a long time know that I haven't had too many supernatural experiences of that sort, but I did have an experience when something horrific was happening in my life, of intense pain, a place where I wasn't having the doubts that you're talking about. But what I did have was I did want to know, where was God in the midst of this? I needed his love. I needed his peace. And I remember I pumped some gas in Nashville, in Green Hills, an area in Nashville. And I walked over and sat on this cement wall and put my feet in the grass. And I was praying. And I remember just feeling as though, and I'm not saying I physically experienced this, as though God just came up from behind me and just kind of wrapped me up in his arms. Yeah. And it was a sense of peace that just came over me, like you're describing, that is not like anything else I've ever experienced in any other psychological state.
Yeah, no, and that's a fair point. And so, yeah, I think at the time it does. And people could still appeal to phenomenal conservatism, which, is the view that you should just sort of accept a default position experience you have unless you have good reason to think it's not. So I think that was the inclination I had. Now, again, you absolutely could explain that psychologically. I don't tout that as this like supernatural miracle that's irrefutable, right? I wouldn't use that in the book that I'm doing as anything that's compelling to anyone outside of that. So I don't consider it to be a strong piece of evidence empirically, but it was an important moment, I think, in that point in my life where I did want to pursue this. And so that's when I got into, I think by accident, stumbling upon some William Lane Craig video. And before we went on air, I made the joke that William Lane Craig is sort of every young apologist's like gateway drug into apologetics, at least for most of them. Maybe that or Ken Ham on the other side, right? Or Braxton Hunter, maybe.
Yeah, Ken Ham was how I got into it, although it was pretty quick Norman Geisler and then William Lane Craig.
Yeah, you move up the echelon. Yeah. So that, and I think every apologist has had the phase where they watch like 5 William Lane Craig debates and they are like, okay, I'm ready to go out and use the kalam and do this and like win a debate. Like they practice this in their head and fantasize about it, right?
Yeah, and I want to say, I know you're trying to move on and I don't want to break your flow, fine. But another thing that should be said about those watching those kind of debates and stuff is how I reacted to seeing these kind of debates at first was I would see Craig make his opening statements and it's like, okay, yeah, that's pretty good. And then I would hear the atheist, whoever they were, but especially if they were good, they'd make their case. And I might be sitting there going, "Oh shoot, man, that's pretty rough.
How is he going to get out of this one?
I hope we got a good one." And then Craig would always come back and respond.
Oh, it's a good rebuttal. Yeah, no, I definitely get that for sure.
Yeah,
in that sense. But that's what got me into that, and I always had these fantasies of doing debates myself in that way, and I did do there wasn't a debate team, but I did have classes on debate in college, which was really fun, and all the tested ones we have, I technically won. The teacher marked that.
Awesome.
So those were always fun, but
you've won every official debate.
Yeah, like the 3 that I had in college, but that did make me want to go out and do it. So I got in contact with through I think various means on Facebook and social media. This was actually during. It was right. I'm fast forwarding a little bit here. So I was in a lot of those groups, and I liked particularly Craig's discussion on the resurrection because I don't think I ever doubted the existence of God. I think it was more about Christianity specifically because God, is this some deistic kind of unfalsifiable God? Sure, like it's hard to disprove that. But Christianity specifically had a lot more going for it, and so Craig's case for the resurrection I thought was really interesting, and that made me want to go out and pursue it myself. And so there wasn't any one book that I thought was like, this is the resource. And so that made me want to go out and make my own version. So it's one of those where I take an argument from this one. So a little bit from Craig, a little bit from N.T. Wright, a little bit from Dale Allison, a little bit from Gary Habermas, Mike Licona, and stitch into this Frankenstein, which sounds pejorative when I say it like that, into a book called Undead, and I made that in 2019. In hindsight, there's a lot in that book that I don't agree with anymore, so I always, whenever I recommend it to people, it's always with some hesitancy, because I think my just writing has gotten a lot better since then, and also just the arguments and stuff like that, and taking things more objectively.
Do you still agree with the major point you were trying to make with each chapter?
Yeah, I do. It was more just individual arguments and like certain things that I like. I don't know if I'd use that argument now because of this reason, right? But the general sentiment, I think, did do it. But I think one of the strongest aspects that I want to do in apologetics, and I do attribute this to reading Dale Allison of all people, who I have a lot of respect for. Dale Allison is he's if I can use the word Christian, he's definitely a very sort of liberal cult, identifies as a Christian, but is by no means an apologist, is a New Testament scholar from Princeton, highly respected in the field. And he's like, yes, I hold to Christianity because of my personal experiences, but historically I just try to look at the facts and I don't make any commitments, right? Including he doesn't even have a strong commitment to the bodily resurrection of Jesus in that way. But I really liked his writing style because he would take every argument, like for the empty tomb or for the appearances, and he would give the counter and post counter. So he's like, okay, here's like the 10 arguments people use, skeptics use these 10, apologists use these 10, and then he ranks them. It's like, this one I don't think is that good, and this one's not good, this one's a little bit stronger. And then he's like, okay, here's the strongest argument the apologists have, and here's the strongest argument the skeptics have, and when I weigh them, like on the empty tomb, for example, he's like, I think the apologist has a slight advantage, so I tentatively accept like the empty tomb is historical, although I do so with like some hesitancy. But so I wanted to take that approach in that writing style. So then I was going to write a book about ethics and God as my second one, but this was right when COVID was hitting. So I lost two grandfathers on each side of the family within a month of each other. Not actually because this is from cancer and other reasons, but that was a month before. No, that was in late 2019, I believe it was. And so early 2020 is when COVID hit. And so I'd already been through a lot because of that, and COVID hitting made things worse. And so that's when I was in the mindset about, oh God, why? And this is COVID and all this stuff, people dying, is it so overkill and necessary? Mm-hmm. And so the book about ethics changed into a book about theodicy and problem of evil. And so I wrote that for a year. And I think it was a week or two before that book was finished, my grandmother did end up dying of COVID in the hospital. And I was in there with her. I stepped out of the room when they did it, but basically she had a bunch of other issues like diabetes, stuff like that. So she was living at home, but she had to have an operation because of an emergency. So they took her to the hospital, and she ended up getting COVID while at the hospital. And she ended up basically going to I don't know if it's septic shock, but a state where she was essentially unconscious and just on a ventilator, and was the doctor told her she was going to suffer from brain damage if she was relieved. And so that was a hard decision, but she did end up dying that night, and I had stepped out because I didn't want to be there in the room when it happened, but it wasn't a pleasant experience. But that happened a week, I believe it was a week before the book came out. So I added a little excursus on the end of that, an epilogue, like in honor of that. So the book about suffering, ironically enough, is bookended. It's bookended by the start of my grandparents dying, and then her dying, like wow. It's the end of it within that time period.
Man.
So that's more of a personal one. But in that book, I wanted to take the approach of looking at arguments and counter arguments. So every time I'd give a theodicy like the free will defense or the soul making theodicy, I'd give, okay, here's objection number 1, here's response to objection number 1, here's objection number 2, response to objection 2, and really sort of show both sides and kind of rank like, okay, where do I think it falls overall? But I think when you're writing, it's really important to you want to be persuasive, but you don't want to convince someone in a way where it's dogmatic. You want to always give the thing and sort of leave them up to their own interpretations. And I think that's true with apologetics. As much as I like apologetics, I don't want to be dogmatic and be like, yes, you have to use this argument, or yes, you have to think this works. I think people should follow the evidence where it leads. And if you really feel like that leads you out of Christianity, then part of me wants to say so be it and follow your heart in that way. But I think we would say that it doesn't, and that it does lead to Christianity in that particular way. But
I think so. And in fact, so where we're at in the story right now, you had looked at the resurrection. Is that where we still are where we're at?
We moved on to problem of evil.
Problem of evil, because you wrote the book on suffering.
Right.
And do you have a particular theodicy you go to?
In that book, no. It's sort of, I just say like there's an amalgamation of them. But I am now much more, having written that 3 years ago now, my views on both those subjects have changed quite a bit. But I am very sympathetic to the idea of what John Hick called soul making, which is the principle that suffering builds us up and makes us stronger. And it's not just a pie in the sky, like, well, maybe things will be better in heaven, right? I think there's actually pretty good evidence that if you look at most studies, people who go through hardships do report being spiritually stronger and saying that they felt closer to God. Like there are studies about people who've had miscarriages, who've been victims of torture, POWs, where they turn to spirituality and religion to help comfort them. And it's even true if you just look empirically. Most of the countries that are the poorest in the world have the most natural disasters. Are the most religious. Right?
It does seem like that even though suffering is probably the most recognizable argument from the atheist perspective, is they'll make an argument from suffering out of the problem of suffering. But yet the closer you get to actual suffering in this world, it seems the more theists you get.
It is. And the people who typically are making arguments from suffering, I'm not speaking for everyone, but generally speaking, are people in Western, either United States or Europe, who are compared to most of the world sitting very comfortably in their lives talking about the suffering. But the people who actually go through that in most cases, and again, I know that there are cases where people fall away, but statistically speaking, the majority of people who do go through horrendous suffering in war-torn areas like sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, places where there's horrible poverty, childhood illness, and all that stuff, are highly religious and in that way, and they don't see that as a conflict between their faith and God. Now, they have different conceptions of God. Maybe they don't hold all the omni properties, but the point still stands that I don't think you can draw a negative correlation between belief in God and extent of suffering. I think it's the opposite, if anything, is true. So that is an interesting observation. It is. Yeah. It is an interesting observation, but that sort of did tie me then to work on miracles, which was sort of meant to be supplementary to the book on the resurrection in that way. But I think my view on miracles based on the book I'm doing right now, has changed my view on theodicy to where I'm more confident in the idea that suffering brings us closer to God than I was when I first wrote that book in that way. And
I feel like that, and that's a great point. But I feel like when you release this book on miracles, people now, at least since you've become more well known online, you have been more well known during the period of time when you've been working on miracles, and it makes me think that's going to be your signature book.
Yeah, no, I definitely think it will be, and that's because I think well, first of all, it's the most thorough. My other books were intermediate to sort of pop level. This one's can probably be 2 volumes and probably close to 800, 900 pages, like between the two of them. So it's way more of an excursus, and I've been doing this now since 2021. So it'll be about 3.5 years by the time the first volume comes out. Probably be close to 4 years when the second one's out. So it's definitely a big extension of that. But no, the reason I wrote the Miracles book was because I'd been curious about the question for a while after the resurrection, because I had a very short section in the last chapter of the resurrection book where I talk about miracles and the conception. I listed a few cases that I had heard of, but I kind of wanted to return to the question because it was pretty supplemental. It wasn't overly extensive when I discussed it there. And I'd always heard about this thing about, did you know that Muslims are having visions of Jesus that convert them? And it's like one of those things that's an open secret in the apologetics community. Like everyone, I think, has heard of that if you ask them that. But I've never seen few people have ever taken up like writing about that.
Yeah.
I was like, that's so weird. I'm surprised that no one like bothers to like look into that, because
I did a video on it.
Yeah. So you're one of the few, but it's not overly discussed as you think it would, because that's a pretty interesting piece of evidence, you would think.
Absolutely.
So the book started off being like an essay on that topic. And then I got into ones about healing, and then that kind of just expanded. And so what started out as like a 60-page essay turned into 400-something pages, or so I guess collectively close to 800-something pages. But
and if you want to know kind of a taste of what that's like, what Caleb's writing about, check out the video we did, I guess, a few months ago on this channel, because he talks about 2 of them, and one of them, he talks about several actually, because you talk about the miraculous stuff that was happening at what's the name of the place? Lourdes, yeah. And then you talked about there was a resurrection. He covers a resurrection that happens, and we were talking about this earlier today with some other people, but I thought this was hilarious. He debated Matt Dillahunty. We both debated Matt Dillahunty, and there was a moment in the debate with Matt where and I'm not going to recall this exactly, but he says something about, well, how come there's no resurrections or something like that? And Caleb says, I actually have one that I think is highly evidenced. So he talks about these things, and Matt's just kind of like, oh, okay. Now he did cover it later and talk about it, but it was a complete shutdown. Because nobody expects you to have a resurrection ready to go.
Yeah. Well, no, usually I feel like I'm Gary Habermas when I say it like this, but typically I'll be like, okay, what's one you want? Like, just give me a category and I can probably find something.
What if somebody said regrowing a limb? That's one that comes up a lot.
Yeah. I actually have a whole chapter called Does God Heal Amputees? And I've done videos with my friend Than from Exploring Reality on that. And I actually just got into, Jimmy Akin, who I was on the debate with recently. He has a podcast about supernatural, paranormal stuff, alien stuff like that. And I had given him a chapter in the book where I discuss a case like that. Now, this is from a few hundred years ago. And he thought it was interesting where I believe at this moment, unless something changes, he's planning on doing an episode on this coming up. So I would recommend, whenever that comes out, looking into it. But yes,
if anybody doesn't know Jimmy Akin's Weird channel, where he talks about weird stuff, it's like what used to be popular, the Coast to Coast AM back before your time, Caleb. There was a show on AM radio that was popular. But if you liked that, you'll like this. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, definitely. But so there are a few cases where people grow back organs, which is essentially analogous to an amputee growing a limb back, because they have, the only organ that grows back is the liver, at least fully. The stomach can sort of grow parts of itself back. But I do have one of an intestine growing back. I do have one of a rib and lung that was removed. That came back.
That doesn't grow back.
No.
Not naturally.
No, none of those grow back, yeah. And then, there is one, at least one well-documented one from a few hundred years ago about an amputee growing a leg back. Now, people will say, well, a few hundred years ago, but take in mind that when you're dealing with an amputee, you're not dealing with something that's easily like, oh, there's a misdiagnosis or something where it's going to be up to clerical error or medical.
So you're
error.
saying if the criticism would be, I can't trust that because how do I know it really happened because it was so long ago?
Yeah.
Or it could have been a misdiagnosis from so long ago. You're like, okay, maybe if it was like COVID or something.
Yeah, it depends on what it is. Yeah, it would. And in the case I'm talking about in particular, if you just want a preview of it, like it was about a certain farmer who was working, a 20-year-old peasant who was working as a farmer who broke his leg. I believe it was the tibia of that tibular fracture, where he had to go to a hospital. This was in Spain, so he goes to the region of Zaragoza, and gets his leg. He gets admitted to the hospital. We have records from when he's admitted to the hospital. He gets his leg amputated. They have to take a iron and sear the stump to stop the bleeding. And the only anesthesia they had back then was wine. So very unpleasant experience, you can imagine. So he becomes a beggar for 2.5 years, gets a license to beg, because back then you had to have a license to beg to show that you were really sick and poor and not just someone who was trying to pull one over on people. And he does this for 2.5 years. He was very well known in the community. He was always outside of the church. He would also help light the lamps. That was his part-time job while he begged for offerings and stuff like that. And he would rub the holy oil of the lamps of the church on his stump, like crying out, like basically for the Virgin Mary, which the place in Zaragoza where this happened had a Marian apparition associated with it from years before. There was a church built to honor her. But he would cry out to her to heal him, right? So this went on for 2.5 years. Was seen by plenty of passersby, and one day he goes back to Calanda, which is where he's originally from, a couple miles out from Zaragoza. For the first time, he meets his family. They, have a reunion. They're sad to see he's an amputee, but they care for him in the house and stuff like that. And when they go back to his room, at the middle of the night, he's sleeping. They see that he has 2 legs back, and so they're like, "Oh my gosh, your leg's back," and that way, and so. This was quickly declared a miracle, and the earliest document we have from this was written, I believe, 3 days after the event. It was a notoriety of like all the 10 witnesses that were there where they interviewed them. He goes back to Zaragoza. The Archbishop of Zaragoza calls for, and this was during the Spanish Inquisition, mind you, so this was when they were like cracking down on like anyone claiming to have revelations or faking miracles. They had a trial on this behalf. And so he was healed in March. The trial was in June, so this is about 2 months later. And we have the minutes from that of every witness. There was about 24 witnesses total they interviewed. A lot of them were neighbors of him. They interviewed the doctors who cut the leg off, the staff who buried the leg in a courtyard, and they asked him, like, is this the man that was you treated? Look at his leg now. Is this the same the leg? And what was interesting is it was the same leg that was originally cut off. So they had originally buried the leg in a box and put it in the hospital courtyard, which was common back then, because the idea was that you're going to be resurrected with your body, so they didn't want to just dispose.
Don't want to lose it. Did they dig up the box?
They dig up the box and it was empty.
No, shut up.
No, it sounds like a magic trick, right? and the leg that was on him had the same scars, birthmarks that this other one was, right? And it had a big circular scar mark from where the cutting had been, from where the saw had gone through. But when his leg had originally turned, it was like he couldn't really walk on it. It was blue and a little bit shorter and curtailed. And we'll get to that in a second. But so anyway, this becomes a big thing. They have this and they officially declare it a miracle, and it gets a lot of press. Now, typically people will push back and be like, well, the natural reaction would probably be to say, well, maybe he didn't have his leg cut off at all, right? He was faking it, and he woke up, and his parents saw him when he had his leg out. He's like, oh, guys, it's a miracle, and people were stupid and bought it, right? But you have the testimony of the doctors, you have the fact he had a license, and we go into all of the, in the book, I go into all of the counter objections, and it gets kind of technical with that. But one thing I thought was interesting, because people were saying, well, look, the fact that his leg was constrained shows that he was basically sort of like flamingo style, binding it up behind it, and was doing, that's why it was like atrophied. But there was actually a study published in 2000 by, I think it was an Italian doctor, Spanish surgeon, where it showed that if you actually look at limb replantations, which is a modern practice like from the 1950s, where they sew up limbs that have been severed from people, it actually looks like that. It's blue, it's contorted, it's shorter because the muscle and bone there, and then over time it grows out, which happened in his case. Over about 3 months it went back to normal. So it's it shows verisimilitude with how people actually get reattached limbs onto them. So I think that's really interesting, right? And so if this was like a faked account, I don't know why you'd make it to where it's like, oh, his leg was like not functional, it took a little bit. Like it's not like the instantaneous kind of one that.
Well, was someone there when they buried the leg?
Yeah, they had the person who testified to burying the leg on the
so there you go.
Well, you would say that, but what's funny is that David Hume, who is very well known for his essay against miracles, right?
Mm-hmm.
He actually mentions this case, and this doesn't get talked about a lot.
He's like, that one's a miracle.
No, he mentions it in his essay, and it's funny because he says like, oh, look, here's a case in Spain. This happened. This would have happened probably 50 years or so, maybe more than that. Prior to, so this was like Hume. It was contemporary to Hume. It was a little bit before him, but within a century. And he says like, look, we have signed witnesses to this. We have testimonies. We have so many people who saw this. Modern technology. And we know this didn't happen. So the fact that you believe stories in the Bible like further to this, and Hume even goes so far as to say that it wasn't necessary because he mentions a particular cardinal who like met the guy afterwards, and the cardinal's like, yeah, I met him and he had 2 legs, and they all told me that he used to only have 1. And Hume's like, it wasn't necessary for this cardinal to go investigate this. No, he was right to just dismiss this offhand because we know that any testimony that backs a miracle is more likely to be false than for the miracle to occur, and so we don't even need to look into it. It's not even worth our time.
David.
So yeah, and that was sort of his view. But I think it's interesting how you do have a really interesting case like that, and it doesn't get that much attention. And as far as I know, I think I'm the most prominent author who's written on that in the English language. There are some who've written Italian and Spanish on it, but there really hasn't been much English language discussion of that. So
that's awesome.
I would like to think that I've written the most.
It was worth having you come down just for that story.
Just for that, yeah. Thanks, everyone. Good night. But so that's one idea. But and of course, that is a Catholic context of a miracle, right? So it definitely is not something that I.
Well, that's where it makes me want to go off and start asking you some questions. But I think you're still.
Well, no, I was wrapping it up. I want to go down.
Yeah. So here's the question. So you said a moment ago something that ever since the earliest days of my interest in apologetics, I took on from Anthony Flew, who famously became at least a deist or something toward the end of his life after being an atheist for many years. And that is follow the evidence wherever it leads. I think you've done that in a unique way that not many apologists have in the following regard. Caleb has presented on a number of occasions in defense of Marian apparitions or an appearance of Mary. Now, these almost always, or if not always, happen in a Catholic context, or maybe in Eastern Orthodox. Maybe you get something like that,
context,
or a Coptic context. Or we have the famous one down there. Yeah. And we used to have some Coptic students at this school that we talked to them about some of that. But the thing is, Caleb is not a Catholic,
or
and
Orthodox.
so
I'm neither. I'm not Orthodox either.
Right, or Orthodox or Coptic. Right, he is following the evidence wherever it leads, and where that has led into is, I think these Marian apparitions are evidential. I think there's good reason to believe that these are, let's just say, supernatural events, for lack of better terminology. But he's not Catholic because he doesn't think that the evidence is ultimately strong enough for him to affirm the dogmas of the Catholic Church. So, how does that work? Are you just at this moment saying, I don't really know what to make out of that, just following the evidence?
My instinctive answer is just to be like, I don't know. My more thought out answer, to the chagrin of most Catholic friends of mine who are just like, oh my gosh, why don't you? This is like so easy. You have the ball teed up and you're not swinging it right. It's a bit more nuanced than that. Now, I will say that I am very sympathetic to having this position. Has made me very sympathetic to people who are skeptics and will say, some of these are really interesting cases, but we just don't know. And as much as I don't want to say it, like, I just don't think I can get to that branch to acceptance supernatural theism because I have so many other issues with Christianity, or with it's so unintuitive to me that I can't even like bring myself to think that that's true. And so I remain agnostic as to what the explanation is, but I still don't think it's this. And you even have the famous example of the person that Craig cites, I believe Pinchas Lapide, right, famous New Testament scholar who was Jewish, who said, you know what, historically I think the evidence is Jesus probably did rise from the dead as the Messiah, but I don't think he was like God. I don't think it was that. He
was like a Messiah to the Gentiles.
Yeah, and he has this very weirdly nuanced view. And to anyone else, it's like, come on, Pinchas, like, are you just like, stretching this out to a way it's really ad hoc? But I also get it, because I could totally see Catholic or Orthodox saying like, okay, so the Virgin Mary appears and you have all this stuff, and yet you don't affirm the Marian dogmas, right? And like, this is something it has bothered me, because I look at something like when Pope Pius, the 10th maybe, in 1950, declared through ex cathedra, through dogma, that Mary was assumed into heaven, and if you deny this, I believe this is close to an exact quote, like, may the wrath of St. Peter and St. Paul be upon you on Judgment Day, or like you will receive that, right? So like that, it's a lot of pressure. So there's a little bit of a Pascalian thing to it too, in terms of like, should I just accept it because of that risk, and if not? So the idea that this could potentially be true, me not accepting it, all of that does bother me, and so I don't hold back from that. So I do think about that, and I have a couple of, my first inclination is to say, well, maybe, God heals people and does miracles just out of the kindness because he's a good God and wants to strengthen people's faith, but doesn't want any particular theological message associated with it, right? You could say that. So if someone prays to a saint and they're healed, then maybe God doesn't care what denomination they are. He just wants to help them out. I think on its face, that's plausible.
Wait a minute. On that, okay, a strength of that was that would maybe speak across the board to the experiences of both Protestants and Catholics being healed, and not always through Catholic saints or with the veneration of Catholic saints. With the Marian things, would you say something like, these people are trying to reach out to God in a particular way, and so God's going to kind of meet them where they are by giving them what they're asking for, type thing?
Yeah, that's how I was going to finish that. I think that part of me wants to say that that's true, although I wonder, like, is God sort of instigating them to have like this, I don't want to say delusion, but if it weren't true, like, is he just promoting them? Is he only going to, he knows that by doing this, he's going to encourage people to have
Catholic
theologically false beliefs, if you think that they are theologically false. Now, you could say maybe God just doesn't care, that this is pure Christianity, that God is just open to that. But I do think there's a distinction one could make with Protestant and Catholic ones, where the Catholic ones are more associated with like this actual figure, and it's not just people who get better when they're sick, but even the people who are praying to saints and getting healed, the Catholic Church does take these and canonizes saints out of that, and God obviously knows that they're going to do that. So he knows by healing this person when they pray the saint that this person's going to be canonized and all this stuff as a saint. So is God promoting that, or at least deliberately doing the case where he knows that's how it's going to be interpreted, right? Or another example, people go to Lourdes, France, which you mentioned. Lourdes is a very, I say very famous, a lot of people haven't heard of it, but within this realm, very well-known site for healing, where in 1858, a young French girl, 14 years old, named Bernadette Soubirous, claimed that a woman kept appearing to her, I believe, over the course of, I want to say it was 18 times, maybe 28, something like that. And on the second to last, and she didn't know who this woman was, and no one else could see her. She was like, "Oh, there's a lady there." I'm like, "I don't see anything." And she would spend hours there. Like, it wasn't just it was like she was dedicated. She would get there, pray. It was a whole thing. But the second to last one, the lady allegedly spoke to her, where she said, "Je suis l'Immaculée Conception," or "I am the Immaculate Conception." Apologize for the butchering of the French there. And so this
was impressive.
Thank you. This led them to believe this was the Virgin Mary, right? Saying, I am Immaculate Conception. And so Our Lady of Lourdes shows her this stream. When she digs into it, there's this water, and so people start taking this water and they start claiming they're healed. The first case was a woman who had a paralyzed hand that she'd had a sewing needle, I believe, stuck in there that had gotten lost in it for years, and her hand was like horribly contorted and stuff. That when she put her hand in the water, she was able to move it for the first time in years. So doctors began looking at this, and they actually now, over the years, have had a medical bureau that investigates these and looks at it. Now, plenty of people go there and aren't healed or think they're healed when they're not, so this isn't like everyone who touches it is healed.
But there still are claimed healings today?
Yes, even today. And people like to say, oh, they knock off. They were more common in the early 20th century than they are now, so it is true that they've gotten less common, but I think a lot of that is because some people will say, the skeptics will say, well, because medicine's gotten better, there's less misdiagnoses and so forth, and so that's why there's less healings. Other people would say, well, it's because medicine's gotten better, and in places like Europe where healthcare is universal, essentially, virtually everyone has access to medicine.
Less of an impulse to go to Lourdes.
It is less of an impulse to go to Lourdes, and it's also one of the criteria that they have to have, and I can go into that if you want, is that it has to be healing that's spontaneous. So it can't be healing that had any contribution to medicine or treatment. They had to be able to say that the medicine treatment did not contribute to the healing, right? But since almost everyone now has access to medicine treatment, it's very hard to make that determination to say that it wasn't contributing to that. But back in the early days when medicine wasn't as widely available, it was a lot harder. So people will look at that, but so people say, well, the ones in the early times were just misdiagnoses, and that might be true for some of them, like neurological cases where people paralyzed. you can't have that because those you need MRIs and stuff to diagnose. So sometimes that is the case, but there are cases where you have something where it's like an amputee healing, where not that an arm goes back, but you have cases where it's such a obviously physical symptom that you can't, it doesn't require modern technology. So like one of the most common diseases healed at Lourdes is tuberculosis, or what was tuberculosis, because that was very common in the early 1900s, where people are coughing up blood. And tuberculosis, once it spreads to the body, often leads to these huge sores, right? And so on your channel, I believe there's one case we went over of a woman who had tuberculosis for 3 or 4 years, was coughing up blood, and her face was eaten away. She barely had a nose, gone, all that stuff. She wore a veil because it horribly ugly. And when she came out of the water, her face was completely healed, like that kind of. So, like again, not something you're going to be easily mistaken about.
Right.
There was another woman case, Marie Borel, who had she'd had appendicitis. She had a surgery, and the surgery was butchered, and so it basically the incision they left opened back up, and they had to restitch it, and it opened up again. And so she got all these fistula around her abdomen, and I think it was 4 on her abdomen, 2 on her back, and these were like so deep that they pierced her small intestine.
Oh my gosh.
And without getting too gross, like pus and like fecal matter were like coming out of that, like draining out of it. And she had to have her stuff drained like several times a day. And she was sick. She had a catheter. She was sick for years, couldn't get out of bed. When she goes to Lourdes and gets in the water, she feels better, catheters removed, and the next day all of her wounds are dried up. And she's completely healed, and she stayed healed for the rest of her life. So you have these people who have really progressive, very visually obvious diseases that go away instantly or almost instantly.
What's your credence that Marian apparitions specifically are real?
Yeah, so...
And that it's Mary.
So tying that to it, to the Marian apparition stuff, I would be inclined to say that they probably are... I think they are supernatural. I don't think they're demonic. I dislike the demonic term because I think it's very ad hoc, and it also opens up Pandora's box to say that anything I don't like is demonic. Right. You know, you could say Jesus raised from the dead by demons if you were a Jew, if you wanted to. Right. So I don't like doing that route. But my go-to answer at the moment, and this could change, is that mere Christianity being true, God wants to convert people to Christianity through miracles and accommodate to where people are at, and so God takes the cultural backgrounds of these places and sort of uses that within, because it would be more efficient to do it in that way than to reintroduce an entirely new concept. So, like, one of the reasons Pentecostalism has been so successful in like Africa and other places, partially because it's very charismatic, but it's also because it blends very well with the like tribal local religions there, because they're also very charismatic in that way. And so I think that God uses, you even see this in Acts where Paul's like, oh, here's your statue of your unknown God, and they start the conversations based off of the milieu.
Well, this is why I was going to ask you is because I remember several years ago, who was the guy that was the, maybe you don't know, the guy who was the friend of David Wood. He was a Muslim convert to Christianity. Nabil Qureshi, that's right. Yeah, so I was listening to him on Unbelievable. This is when he was still living. Yeah. And he was talking, I was listening to it when he was still living, and he was talking about Muslim, the appearances that you were talking about earlier, Jesus' appearances to Muslims. And he was asked why that seems to be the mode so often that we see in that context. And he said, well, because if these particular Muslims expect to get anything other than the Quran, what they expect to get is some sort of a vision or something like that. Right. And so God appears to them in the way that makes the most sense. And he said, another example of this, and I've always thought about this, it's one of those hypothetical, we're just speculating. But he said, with speaking in tongues, for example, he said, I'm inclined to believe that actually what we're talking about here is a known language. It's not, it's like xenolalia instead of glossolalia, that thing. Right. And it is a known language, and then you're not speaking in ecstatic utterance or something. And he said, but in the Bible, but he said, but I know so many people that I genuinely believe are telling me the truth, and they have these experiences where they're doing ecstatic utterances. And he said, I just wonder if it's not that God is looking down and thinking, okay, they're trying to connect with me. I'm going to honor that in some way or another. Now, that's always been weak for me, but it came to mind when you were talking about this.
Yeah, it is. And it's something that you see with, like, one of the things you notice about Marian apparitions, I think counts against them a little bit, is that they are inconsistent in terms of her description. So if she's appearing in Lourdes, she looks like a European white woman about the age of 14. When she appeared allegedly in Guadalupe, Mexico to the Aztecs, much more Latina skinned, woman with like Aztec kind of imagery. If she appears in Africa, she's African American. She's black. If she's in Japan or China, it looks more Asian. So she fits that. And I've heard some Catholic apologists say, well, she just does that to adapt to the culture. Now, of course, if you're a skeptic, your response is going to be, well, yes, people have hallucinations or things based off their expectation. It'd be more impressive if they were all consistent across culture, right?
Yeah.
But I think there is something to be said about adapting to that. And I when I look at something like Lourdes, if you look at the time frame, this was right after the French Revolution in the late 1790s, where Catholicism was very much disliked, and this was the height of rationalism when they were basically suppressing the church. But Catholicism was the traditional view in France and even like Spain and stuff like that. So if God wanted to start a revival there and he did it through, I don't know, Pentecostalism or Baptists, it probably would not have been as effective there. But it is actually impressive that even today France is still a very secular country, generally speaking, but Lourdes is still a huge place of pilgrimage that people go to in an otherwise pretty secular country. And I think that's really interesting. And actually with the major Marian apparitions, that's the case. If you look at Fatima, which I don't even necessarily think is like miraculous in that way, but Fatima happened in Portugal in the early 20th century when Portugal was, I think, close to communist, or was communist, where they were suppressing religion. Medjugorje, which happened in Yugoslavia, which was communist at the time, was very oppressing to that. And you have it in Zaytun, which is I think the most interesting one, the Coptic one in Egypt, when the Coptic Christians were getting persecuted and were very much disliked by the Muslim population there. This is right after the Israel 6-day war with Israel and Egypt as well, so tensions were already very high. So it is interesting that when you look at other religions, there are big places of pilgrimage, or places that are friendly, generally speaking, friendly to that. India is going to have Hindus, Muslims going to be in the Middle East, but the places that are the most friendly, the places that have the most like pilgrimage sites with those Marian apparitions, are, with the exception of maybe I think Mexico, are places that were generally hostile to. And of course, even Mexico was not originally Catholic. They were Aztec. They had Aztec religions and were converted through the conquistadors. But even the conquistadors have a tradition with Our Lady of Guadalupe where they say Mary appeared to the Aztecs there and converted. That image alone, I believe, converted close to 9 million people over the course of several years. Like, it's actually the biggest, as far as I know, the biggest mass conversion.
That's what the conquistadors say happened?
Well, that's what I think the records at the time had, like how many people we have converting to Catholicism that were Aztecs within that period, because allegedly the Virgin Mary appeared to this and left. It's almost like they have a version where it's like the Shroud of Turin. They have the tilma, the Guadalupe image. It looks like a painting on this. And the story is that there was a man named Juan Diego who, the Virgin Mary appeared to him, and he opened up. He wanted to sign. Oh yeah, you can bring it up. Guadalupe. If you look up Our Lady of Guadalupe Tilma, it'll be up there. Guadalupe. There we go. Tilma. Tilma. That. Yeah. There you go. So it's this image, right, that looks like it. So they have this framed, you can see, in like their big church. So this is allegedly an image that appeared on side of someone's robe as a sign when the Virgin Mary appeared. Now, I don't personally think that that's miraculous. I think you could. The data
You're
I've
saying
seen
this
on
appeared. They're saying
they are saying now the historical data for this, the source is like pretty old, so I don't think that the evidence is good for this, but it's just the tradition, right? But my point is whether or not this is actually true. This story did end up converting millions of Aztecs to Catholicism, right? Because they would go visit this and they really believed this happened.
And this appeared where?
This allegedly appeared, I believe when she appeared to Juan Diego, he wanted a sign, and she like created this on the inside of his robe with like roses and stuff like that.
Oh, this is Juan Diego's robe, huh?
I believe it was like part of it, yes.
Okay.
So that's a copy, but
that's
get the that's not the authentic.
That's if you
one,
wanted it home.
yeah, right, exactly. So it's interesting. So it's kind of their like version of the shroud where it's like an image on it. But actually, I think what would be cool for your viewers to see, and this was on the debate I did with Jimmy Akin, if you want to see, was Zaytun. So the one. That one, that's probably the most well-known one. That one, as far as I know, is actually authentic. So the story behind this one is that in the late 60s, I should reverse back. So in the early 1920s, there was a businessman, Muslim, I believe, named Ibrahim, who was going to build a hotel in this spot. And now Zaytun is well known in the Coptic tradition. Again, I don't think this is historically true, but in Matthew where it says they went to Egypt to flee Herod, the Coptics have a tradition that Mary stopped by what's modern day Zaytun in that area to rest. Like that's the place the Virgin Mary stopped by, so they have a high regard for it. So Ibrahim goes to build a hotel on the spot, and he has a dream where the Virgin Mary says, no, don't do this, build a church instead and give the money to the poor. So he does this, and the church is dedicated to the Virgin Mary. So that's in the 20s. In the 60s, in 1967, fast forward, a Muslim man looks up and sees what he thinks is a nun who's going to jump from this church, a woman in white. And so a bunch of people get around as a crowd and look up at it and like, oh, don't jump, all this stuff. And they look, and she's kind of shimmering and it look a little ethereal. And she then vanishes and be like, oh, maybe that was the Virgin Mary. Now, if that happened one time, you could say some weird light people just mistook for the Virgin Mary, right? But the weird thing is this happened actually hundreds of times over the course of 3 years, always in this same church, either in the courtyard or on the roof. At first, the police thought this was street lights that were being reflected, and they turned off. They knocked those down, and the light was still there. They searched for a projecting device, could not find any.
That's good to know.
At one point, they turned off all the power in the city, and it was still there, and they could not find what this was. And people claim to have been healed by this. They actually had doctors from the University of Cairo investigate some of these, and some of these were medically inexplicable. But you have this image of what people believe to be Mary coming here on top of this church dedicated to the Virgin Mary, and literally close to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people saw this over the course of 3 years, including the president of Egypt at the time. And we also have articles written by anthropologists who were even atheists at the time who saw this, and it didn't convert them. They said, yeah, I saw a light there, and if I winced, I could see how it sort of looked humanoid, but no one has really been able to come up with a good source of where the light comes from. The closest you've seen is someone trying to say that they're earthquake lights. Which sometimes happen when earthquakes happen. But the article that was published on
earthquake lights.
Yeah. So the theory is that the friction of the geothermal friction from the platelets of the Earth can cause like light because of the way that the friction's going, which has never actually been demonstrated, by the way. But the theory is that sometimes you do see weird lights when earthquakes happen, but these typically only last for a few minutes. They're not formulated in the way that you see with Zaytun. And the study that did this looked at earthquakes that were 400 kilometers around there. So we're saying an earthquake, what's the difference between Evansville and Indianapolis? You know, it's further than that. It's like if you're saying like anywhere in Indiana there was an earthquake, you could have a light. So the theory is that earthquakes happening all across within Egypt happen to have lights that happen in this exact same spot for this time. And that's why it's getting criticized. Like you've never seen earthquake lights repeat in the same area that way. And of course, with the prediction of the Virgin Mary appeared to this guy in a dream and said she was going to appear, and all this stuff like combined with that, I think just makes that so.
So hold on, let me ask this. So what did nobody like get a ladder and go up there?
I think it was so it's actually really hard to get up there because the way the dome is shaped, it's not like you're not going to be able to get a person like up there very easily. It's very slippery. But I think no one attempted it because out of respect, once people started saying this was Mary, they were like genuinely concerned that I don't know that would be disrespectful, but they did try finding any kind of projection devices from inside the church, from outside of it.
Okay, that's good.
So there still has been no like generally agreed upon thing of what this was in this way. But this also isn't the only incident. There was other churches also dedicated to the Virgin Mary, also in Egypt, that have had weird lights on top of them. Same thing, it's been investigated. Sometimes lights are inside of the church, sometimes they're outside. You can find some of those online too. If you look up Our Lady of Warraq, Warraq. This one is in 2009, so it's in color. Now it's kind of blurry. This one's not as well attested as Zaytun because it only happened on one night. But you can see those like weird lights that appear on top of this church, and that way that people like photographed and stuff like that. So.
Okay. So now this is interesting. So am I to take each of these lights as being part of the experience, or just the humanoid-looking one?
And that's a good question. And some people with Zaytun would see multiple lights, and sometimes they'd see other ones. In fact, if you look with Zaytun, there were also these. If you want to go back to the Zaytun ones, there look up the Zaytun doves. Yeah, we'll go back to all of that, and you see multiple lights with that. So there was the main light of the Virgin Mary, and one more.
Dang it. Oh, it was just right here.
Yeah,
sorry.
There you go. Yeah. You don't have to delete all of that. Just, add doves to that, and you'll see them there. All right, so scroll down. Okay, so you can see on top of her one of those, right, where it looks like a bird. And the Virgin Mary.
Is this what we're talking about?
That's one of them, yeah. So go to that one down there, left, that one. So that one is what's supposed to be doves floating in the shape of a cross. This was also around Zaytun. So you see these like other lights as you see, right?
Yeah.
And you can see different like images of that. But,
Is this like a close up on one?
No,
aspect?
that's a different miracle with someone having a Eucharist appear from the mouth allegedly.
You know all these miracles, don't you?
Yeah, I told you it's a big book. I know that was fun to go through.
It was a nice little field trip.
It was, but it's one of those things where that has made me realize more too, where people want to pull arguments from silence to say like, if, and I don't have an opinion on whether this happened or not, but in Matthew 27 when it says all the dead roam through Jerusalem and no one else mentions this except for Matthew, and like everyone would have talked about it. It's like, okay, we can have a case where literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people claim that the Virgin Mary appeared with photographs in newspapers in the modern day, with most people being literate, and most Western people have never heard of this.
Right, that's right.
And yet we want to say that people back then in the culture was mostly oral and illiterate, that this would have just been talked about everywhere and we'd have a bunch of sources for it. And I just don't find that, given how common this stuff is.
Even a lot of Catholics wouldn't be aware of some of these. Like they may have heard of Fatima. Like you'll, or they may be able to say, I think I've heard something about that.
Yeah, but they wouldn't like know it. You think this would be in like every history book?
They wouldn't say, no, I know that spire. That's from a different Marian apparition.
Yeah. So, but it's interesting, and I that's one of my favorite cases because it's just there's so much out there, and I'd say I don't really know what to do with it, but part of me loves it because it's like such a well documented miracle case that I've never seen any atheist be able to properly address, at least not in full. Mm-hmm. But part of me also has that cognitive dissonance in terms of, well, this isn't great for my Protestantism, but I'd be more uncomfortable as an atheist, so at least I'm sort of in the right route.
Right, yeah. No, that's one of the things, as I say, that I like about your story and your position is that you're saying, look, I'm following the facts. This is where I am. I know it looks weird, but that's where I am.
Right.
And I like that. And I'm sure that the Catholics like that to some degree. But it's still, I like it too. So what else could we go from here?
Well, I think the miracles thing is interesting with going back to the problem of evil for a second too, mm-hmm. because I was going to tie this into it earlier, but I think that this perspective has really made me reevaluate theodicy in a different light, because when people talk about how there's greater goods to things and stuff like that, a lot of times it's just sort of wishful thinking in terms of, well, I can't see how this could be good, but maybe it will turn to. But for a while, like the amount of sufferings would bother me. Like I can understand people going through problems to help them, but people who go through horrendous suffering with horrible diseases, holocausts, genocides, some of that seems like it's gratuitous. Couldn't God build us up in a way that wasn't as excessive, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But looking at these cases, I have yet to find any case, and some of these people have been sick for decades, gone through horrible, even some of the Lord's cases, you just feel so bad hearing about these people. And whenever they healed, or they will say believe that they're healed for the sake of argument, never once have I ever seen someone who was still bitter saying, well, it's great I was healed, but I wish God would have done it 10 years earlier. It's always, they're so happy about it, and it's part of their testimony, and they're like, it was worth it, and I'm so grateful that I have this story now. And mm-hmm. So if miracles are sort of snapshots of heaven, I think that's how it will be. And so I think empirically, if we can see people who go through decades-long chronic illness, suffering, including people who've gone through torture and stuff like that, feel like that religious experience to them strength makes it worth it, and that these are the victims themselves and they don't feel like it was gratuitous, how can we possibly say, well, that's too much for God, that's too much, God can't use that for good? Because again, like, and we're saying this as people who haven't gone through what they've gone through, and if they're grateful for it, can we say from a third party perspective that no, what they went through was too much and was not worth it? Mm-hmm. I don't think we can. So miracles to me have made it seem like more apparent than ever that people can go through horrible things and yet have their faith strengthened in the end. And not everyone in this life does get that, but I do think that will happen in the afterlife, and miracles are just the little peeks behind the curtain, so to speak, for certain people. Well,
that's beautiful, but it also makes me wonder about something else, which is, okay, you have looked at this stuff, and there's a lot of ooey gooey sentimental type stuff in this. We hear your stories and we feel emotional, we feel the warm fuzzies. And then we think about your theological positions in general, and we find another one that is criticized often mm-hmm. for being arrived at mm-hmm. just because you're such a lovey-dovey, fuzzy guy. And that position is one where you differ from a number of most of your William Lane Craig style apologists out there.
Right.
And that is on the issue of hell. For those that don't know, there are at least three positions that are somewhat commonly, well, I wouldn't even say universalism is commonly held, but that evangelicals can hold on a position, on the position of hell, and that you'll see crop up. And one of those is the eternal conscious torment view, which sounds awful. It is the view that most Americans, particularly middle America people, grew up with over the past 40, 50, 60 years. In fact, it's the position of the church largely throughout church history. But in the early church, there were two other positions as well. There was the position called conditional immortality that you may know as annihilationism, and that is the view that you will one day be annihilated and you won't be conscious anyway, experiencing suffering forevermore, that it will come to an end as far as that goes. And then there's another position, and that position is called universalism. Some people take an evangelical universalist perspective, and there have been books by that title. And it might shock you to hear that someone who, other than on that kind of an issue, agrees with you on most stuff. And so we find ourselves saying, hold on, in Mark chapter 9, Caleb, it talks about it'd be better for you to cut off your arm than to go into life with one arm than to go into death with two arms. It'd be better to, where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth, cut off your leg, gouge out your eye, the worm doesn't die. This sounds pretty awful. And we learn in the book of Revelation that there's going to be a lake of fire and all that. How in the world can someone hold to something like universalism in light of all of that? Since you know you're obviously wrong, how can you claim you're right?
Yeah, no. Thank you for the loaded question. No, that it is a good consideration, and I agree that a very literalistic reading of Scripture would probably get you to something that's not universal. If you were just to take the verses about this is suffering, I agree. It just hand to a random person, they would say, yeah, this looks like they suffer forever, right? But there's plenty of places in the Bible where you can do that, and I think even places where we wouldn't agree that you should just take the most straightforward reading. You have to look at cultural context and all this stuff. So I think we should be using the perpetuity of Scripture consistently in this regard. So I would say that, yes, if you look at the hell passages by themselves, many of them, some of them might be conditional leaning, some of them might be eternal conscious torment leaning. You could get that way, but you don't see this lovey-dovey kind of reconciliation in those passages themselves. But when you do look at Scripture as a whole, and as a complete idea, I do think you see within the character of God, a God who is unconditionally loving in that way, who, as 2 Peter says, desires that none shall perish, but all should be saved in that way. And you do have verses in Colossians 1:20 where all of creation is reconciled before God, not just death being defeated, but reconciliation. And it's really hard for me to imagine a world where reconciliation happens where the majority of the population is still hating God in the separate realm that's sort of just isolated in that way. Mm-hmm. And in that way. And so when you have that, and you have passages about how he's a savior to all people, just as in Adam all die, so also in Christ all shall be made alive. And you know these with all your Calvinist Arminian debates in terms of what all can mean and stuff like that. But in Philippians, where we learn that every knee will bow and confess that Christ is Lord, I think many people take that to be almost like out of fear, like we're please.
They're
God,
being forced.
Doing it. Yeah, it
bow
is.
before me, you heretic.
And it's almost in a way that's, I don't want to say authoritarian, but it kind of like almost like how everyone in North Korea applauds for Kim Jong-un when he's coming down, where it's like purely out of fear, right? In that way, and it says to the glory of God in that way, and I wonder what gives God more glory. Is it seeing people grovel to Him because they're scared of that, or is people seeing who are genuinely repentant and genuinely have been won over by Him, right? And when it says that, and it seems to me like if you look at passages where people say, "Oh, Lord, did we not do all these things in Your name?" and Christ says, "I never knew you." Clearly, God does not like people who just snivel up to Him just because they can. He wants people who are genuinely repentant. So when I see people bring glory to God by having every knee bow down to Christ, I do think that implies rather strongly that this is the end all be all for all people that God will ultimately achieve. And it's funny that as much as Calvinists and Universalists are pretty much polar opposites of each other, the one thing I think they have in common is that they do preserve the sovereignty in that way where God is not compromising. God gets what He wants in the end. It's just that under Calvinism, what God wants is, for many people, morally very questionable. Whereas for Universalists, God gets what He wants in the end. And for, I think, the Arminian, they would typically say, well, God has to compromise. Ultimately, God wants people to freely love Him, but darn people's free will gets in the way of that. And so God, with a bleeding heart, has to watch his children basically kill themselves, and he's essentially helpless to save them from themselves. And to me, when Scripture says that nothing can separate us from the love of God, neither death nor hell, nor life, nor et cetera, I don't think that our own wills are an exception to that, essentially. Now, I don't think that God gives us a divine lobotomy. I don't think he overrides our freedom to that, as many people want to say. He's not kicking you, grabbing and screaming into heaven. But it's a change, it's rehabilitation. So universalists would say, yes, there absolutely is a hell. People go there who have not accepted Christ as their Lord and Savior. It's not just everyone goes to heaven automatically, no matter what religion you are. But hell is remedial. Hell is not prison. It's not an execution chamber. It is a basically drug rehab. It's an AA meeting, essentially, but on much more severe levels. And no, I think Universalist has like a conception of what this will look like, just as no one really has an idea of what hell will look like. It's all very speculative.
But even though it's not monolithic, there are a number, like for a lot of people that think, how in the world could you ever defend, kind of like I presented a moment ago?
Yeah.
The response would be, well, because a lot of those things that you think count against my position, I'm not a universalist. Caleb leans that way, but I would think that what you would say is, while a lot of those things you might think count against the position, they actually are affirmed by our position. For example, there are many universalists who affirm a hell, and that hell may happen for a long time,
yep.
and that it may be very unpleasant, and they have very different ways of describing what they think that unpleasant experience will be like, right?
Right.
So when you point at, look here, it says fire, and it says be better to cut off your arm, and all, they're going, yeah,
it's not, right. Yeah, as my friend Andrew Huronich, who's one of the bigger proponents of these, who just had a book came out that I'd recommend, says hell is not Hawaii, right? I would, if I had to guess what hell would be, I would imagine it'd be something akin to like a Christmas Carol, where you're basically going through and seeing the stage of your life and realizing like how much you wasted, every person in need who you didn't help, and the stress of that is just so tormenting. I also like the idea that Tim Keller wasn't a universalist, said of hell, where hell is getting everything that you thought you wanted in life and realizing how miserable you are, right? And
but these ideas that you're raising would go along with the notion that this is remedial, and
yes.
that's why I think it
yes.
would be something like the Christmas Carol, insofar as in the Christmas Carol you're learning.
Right,
from this.
Exactly. And
yeah.
Scrooge changes in the end because of it. But Scrooge sees his own death and he sees how his actions have led to the deaths of others, and it's horrifying in terms of how negative that impact is. So I think that there's so much psychological torment in that, right? Like hell might be Hitler having to watch the death of every person he ever killed and feel and seeing every scream and every ounce of pain that they've went through in that way, to realize how these people were not just statistics. They're human beings who each have their own lives and stories. And so hell under that concept may very well look like that. Now, people will say, how do you deal with the hell passages about eternal destruction, eternal fire? And there's a couple different approaches. A lot of universalists want to take the approach where they say that the word ion or ionios, which is eternal, can be translated to mean for an age. And that is true. You do see it, I believe it's in, I want to say it's in Colossians, where Paul says these have been kept secret for ionios, for an age, but have now been revealed to us. And obviously in that context, he doesn't mean eternally. So it can mean that in the Greek, but it is context dependent. And you do have verses.
Well, yeah, in the book of Jude, it's ionios, fire, I think, that comes down on Sodom and Gomorrah. So
right.
It's like there you're tempted to think that the way ionios is being used is like God fire or heavenly fire, God stuff.
Right, it is. And it's also like the idea that you have, you don't want to take that too far, because you could say, what about John, like, who will have eternal life? Is it saying a life for an age? Is it saying, like, do we make that mean salvation is also not eternal if we want to play that game? So especially when you have the parallelisms of like, just as you have the sheep and the goats to this, so also just as you have eternal destruction, so also you have eternal life, and so it's this direct parallel. So I don't really like.
Well, hold on there. The annihilationist obviously would say eternal destruction, you're destroyed. And that state will be the case eternally, everlasting.
Yeah. And it's funny that you say that. I think that that's actually, I think that would be an interpretation I would take. But the difference is that when we're talking about the person who's destroyed, I would say, who does Paul say, when we talk about baptism and the old being put off and the old self being destroyed, I think you could say, yes, the wicked part of us that is destroyed forever in eternal fire. We agree on that. But out of that fire, do we have a phoenix that rises from the ashes, or is that where it ends, right? And so if you read Scripture in context, you might say, well, maybe it does extend to that. So maybe we agree that the old wicked parts of us are destroyed in eternal fire, and eternal meaning the consequences are eternal, not that it's forever conscious in that way. So,
but you know what's weird to me about it? I'm not the first to point this out. There's been a lot of people say this, but when it comes to this term and some of the other aspects of thinking through hell, traditionalists, by which I mean those who affirm eternal conscious torment, and universalists have some similarities in the ways they see this that annihilationists, conditional immortality, don't have.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, about the extent of that. And I think that also you have like the verses that talk, and I brought this in my debate with Chris Date. If, by the way, I did debate Chris Date on this, who's a conditionalist, so if you want to watch that, it's from a few years ago. Video quality was worse and I was heavier, but you know, putting those things aside, it was I think a decent debate. And Chris,
did you lose a bunch of weight?
I did lose a bunch of weight. I probably lost 35 pounds in the last couple of years. Yeah, no, it's
praise the Lord.
Great. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
You know, shedding weight like we're shedding the old self.
I put it all on, but
well, I wasn't going to say anything. No,
I lost when I first came to Evansville. I lost 50 pounds.
Yeah.
And then I kept it off for a number of years. It crept back on, though. Children can do that too.
Oh, that's great.
But anyway, so you're now. Here's something I was going to ask you about, though, or I was going to say. I've heard Hronich make this connection between that every knee shall bow, every tongue confess. And here we have in 1 Corinthians 12:3, therefore I make known to you that no one speaking by the Spirit of God says Jesus is cursed, and no one can say Jesus is Lord except by the Holy Spirit. And so the notion is to say that, to back up your point, that if every knee shall bow and every tongue confess, you can't even do that Jesus Christ is Lord, those words.
Right.
You can't even do that without the power of the Holy Spirit. Now, I presented this to Jonathan Pritchett, one of my co-hosts here, and he said, I don't buy that. He's like, what you're telling me, without the Holy Spirit, I can't string together the syllables that make the sounds Jesus is Lord, and so I couldn't do that, just because he is okay with the no, you're forced to, you're gonna bow. But I do think on the face of it, this passage and that one go well together.
And what does it say in Romans about if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord
and believe in
He rose from the dead,
you will be saved?
Well, they're confessing with their mouths, and clearly, if they're saying before him, they probably believe He was risen from the dead. So, I mean, now, and I get that, because you do have the part where they're like, "Oh Lord, Lord, didn't we do this?" And He says, "I never knew you." So certainly, people can be false prophets, and the Bible clearly talks about. But I do think it does come down to the sincerity and the glory of God. And in the Philippians passage that does say that every knee shall bow, which I think is a reference to, I think it's an Old Testament. I think he's citing somewhere in the Old Testament when he says that. Maybe it's in Isaiah where he does that. It does say to God's glory. So if you want to say that God is being glorified by people sniveling up to Him out of fear, you could say that, but I don't find that to be like a very plausible interpretation from the God who really wants people to do this, who's sincerely like heartbroken that they're not, in that kind of way. Now you could say maybe His justice is bringing that about glory, but it is up to that. I will say though, with the eternal verses that talk about eternal destruction, one interpretation you could take, I think, is the one that I said, where the old self is killed, and that's basically the conditionalist reading, but we're just saying that there's a distinction between the dichotomy of our new selves and old selves, like when we're baptized by fire, which Jesus talks about, baptism by fire. Paul talks about it in 1 Corinthians 3. But I think another really, and this is not like I was going to say an Orthodox Christian Universalist view, but that may be somewhat of a paradox. But like not a view that's very common among Christian Universalists, was something that Alvin Plantinga, of all people, actually brought up. And I don't think he was a strict Universalist, but he sort of, from what I understand, like toyed with it. He was like, maybe it's true. And Plantinga said, and again, like there's no scriptural, I think, explicit one that affirms this, but it's consistent to say, what if hell is sort of like a revolving door, to where there's always people going in there, they're remediated, more people go in there, and it's this eternal cycle. And so hell is always occupied. And so eternal hell in that sense is actually occupied. There always is weeping and gnashing. There's always this.
But would you not need more people to go into hell from earth? Like, does that result in some eternal
regeneration almost? Well, you could say, I guess you could say, and I actually am sympathetic to that view, because like, why would I don't see why God would stop with this X many people when he comes back. Like, he could always save one more person, right? Unless
Right.
you have this really strict view where, like, no, this is the absolute most feasible world, and God could not save like a single more person, or that wouldn't make it better. And so I think, I don't see why God wouldn't continue this forever and ever and ever as a sign of sort of eternal victory.
That is really interesting. Now, let me ask you this pressing question. If you found out that one of the other two views on the nature of hell was true, would you still be a Christian?
I would still be a Christian, although I would probably take a skeptical, and when I say skeptical, I mean
agnostic.
I would be like a divine skepticism. I would say that if you were to ask me about how do I reconcile this with like the overall story of theodicy and so forth, I would just say I don't know. God's ways are higher than mine, and maybe that is the correct answer. But if you're going to press me for an ending to this story, I would say that universalism to me makes the most sense, because when I look at the problem of evil and theodicy, I say, okay, why does God create the world? Well, he creates the world because he's a good God. He wants to create persons that are very valuable, that he wants to have a relationship with, that he wants to give free will. And this is the meaning of it. And God wants to have them learn and to grow spiritually and morally and develop virtues so that they can be with him. And this is a very good thing. That's the general purpose of creation in that way. But then you get the question of, okay, well, why do some people fail this test? Why does God create some who he knows, quote unquote, will be damned, right, in this way? And that question always bothered me. And one solution that you could say that I don't think is very satisfying is to say that, well, God creates the unsaved because they are essentially necessary for the saved to be saved. So John might not become a Christian unless his atheist friend Paul exists and they interact,
Right.
and that's what leads him to it through some kind of Molinism or whatever.
And you could never have, and to add to this, someone might think, well, yeah, but maybe he could just only create the, but then if you only created them, like this is the point you're making, you change the board, you change the set, and there will always be people now who perhaps who are now unregenerate, right?
Yeah, people who might be regenerate might be unregenerate in different circumstances, right? Yeah. So if the circumstances, but I think that to me that's really not satisfying, because then you're basically saying that the non-believers are sort of a means to an end, that they're chess pieces on the board, that the pawns that have to be taken by the queen to win. And so God is like, well, you know what, Paul, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to make you, because, and this is basically what William Lane Craig's position is too, that he's like, well, why should they have veto power over what God wants? Like, they shouldn't be able to override that just because it's unfortunate for them, right? Because it's their freedom, and so they're so responsible. But I don't know. I do sympathize with that idea, that I feel like God would only create the ones who would be saved. And I do have to wonder that if God's going to gamble, I don't mean like an open theist, like he doesn't know how it's going to come out to, but if God's looking at the options to say, I could either not, if the only options I have are, if we're assuming that I cannot create a feasible world where everyone is saved and has free will or whatever, that my only options are create a world where I can have all these good things, but it's going to cost a huge amount of collateral, where people go through suffering that ultimately leads them away from me. Either they get destroyed or eternally separated from me, which breaks my heart, which I don't want. But in exchange, I get to have a relationship with a lot of good people that I love, or just not create anything at all and just have God be there in his perfection with the Trinity. I think it might be better for God to not create at that point, if that's the calculus, if those are his only options that he has to weigh. So it's really hard.
This is a thought that comes up a lot. I think we all have to face that. Why did he make anything if anyone is going to go to hell? Right. Now, on the conditionalist perspective, we could have Chris Tate here, and he might say, well, and I don't want to speak for him, but he might say from the conditionalist perspective something like, look, these people still had many positive hedonic moments. They experienced many pleasurable, good things in life. But he wouldn't argue this, because actually he wants to point out that judgment on annihilationism is horrific. So
but like, is that, but would we use that argument with anything else? I mean, I think that we talked about over lunch, like concepts like antinatalism, which are these weird philosophical ideas of, is it okay to have children or not in certain circumstances? And I think that kind of applies to here too. Like, can you say, well, this baby that was born with this horrible degenerative disease that left it in pain, for that, if that baby even got a few seconds of smile and happiness, that was all worth it, versus it not being. And I don't want to draw a line here in terms of saying like it's better for kids. No,
it's tough
to do that, but it is a tough question for sure. And I not to disparage Chris Date, but like I do think that that's coming from a place of I don't want to say of privilege, because I know that him and everyone has been through horrible things in their lives, horrible struggles. But there are people who live in horrible chronic illness and do all this stuff who are separate from God. You could even look at some of the Jews who went through the Holocaust, who went through unimaginable horrors, and assuming some of them left their faith and lost that in the Holocaust, would that be worth it to make them go through all that suffering for it to have no end game, just for a short period of pleasure? I don't think any parent would justify their child being tortured just because their child had some good memories too. You don't, when you commit a crime, you don't say, well, here's all the good things I did, officer, so
That's
we
true.
can ignore the bad ones.
That's
you have
true.
to say, well, no, I don't care if you opened up all these orphanages. If you murdered that one orphan, you just have to pay. That your good acts don't outweigh the bad.
Yeah.
So I just don't think you can try to outweigh that unless the evil is directly going to correspond to the good. Is in that way. And so you're willing to take that view, but I feel like that just commits you to a view of freedom and humanity, where you're going to say that the pursuit of this is such a great good that any amount of evil is going to be overcome. And I think that, to me, that I can only say that if the evil is instrumental in bringing about the good. But if there's so many people who fail that test, who are just destroyed or separate from God forever, who also went through horrendous suffering, it does legitimately make that suffering, I think, horribly impactful. And I'm sorry, not horribly impactful. The suffering they have in hell is horribly impactful, but it does make it pointless towards their salvation story, because ultimately it fails. And I have the same problem with atheism too, in terms of problem of evil. I don't mean an intellectual problem, but I do think that atheism is so detestable to so many people in terms of attractiveness, because it's saying, and I don't mean the whole William Lane Craig asserting life without God, because you could say that maybe life has temporary value, or it doesn't have to be ultimate value for it to be worthwhile. But if you're going to say that, to say, well, put aside eternality, life can still have meaning, you're going to have to say the suffering in life is also significant. You wouldn't say, oh, this person has gone through this horrible suffering, but they'll be dead in 10 years and won't remember any of it, so who cares? Obviously, no, that suffering is bad, and it's bad that they're suffering it, and we're not just going to be psychopathic towards it or indifferent because, well, when they're dead, they're not going to care, so why should I care now? Obviously, no, in this moment, it's horrible that they're going through that, and we don't want that.
Yeah.
So I just don't see how that really gets you out of it. And to me, it's an entailment of God's plan in this whole story. So I would just ask anyone who doesn't hold to that view, which I respect those positions. What is the salvation story? What is the reason? What is God's sort of plan that He has worked out here in terms of how He came to, it's better for me to do this than not, in the story of salvation? And universalism to me is sort of the only real cohesive story I see out of that.
Well, listen, I really appreciate you sharing your take on all these things. Is there anything else that we didn't talk about that you thought, man, I really do want his audience to hear this?
I don't know. I don't think your audience knows how nice your studio is here, so maybe that. But,
I said, is this what you thought it would look like? He said, it's bigger than I thought.
Yeah,
this room is bigger than you think it is.
I thought he did this in his basement his whole time, but no, he's a whole setup here is actually really cool, so I like that. No, I do appreciate being on here. I didn't have anything else. I know we spent the whole past hours on this and over lunch talking, so it's been great. Yeah. But I didn't have anything off the top of my head if you wanted to wrap it up.
Well, I wanted to encourage people to check out Caleb's stuff. Maybe you don't disagree with him on one of the theological issues that we talked about in the midst of this, but you're interested in the miraculous, and you're interested in getting as best you can a non-biased take. When you've got a guy who's not Catholic but is saying Marian apparitions are real or seem real, then I think where we're at is you've got a more biased guy than a lot of people you might suspect. So I encourage you to check out that book when it comes out, but you don't have to wait for the book. You can go check out Caleb. If you just go go on YouTube and type Caleb Jackson and miracles, I think you'll come up with his appearances on Capturing Christianity, which is a huge channel, our channel, and some other channels, and just check it out, because one of the things he was telling me on the way over here is he said, there's so many great miracle stories that I can trade them out, and each time I go on somebody's show, I can talk about a different miracle. So there's actually benefit to going to hear everything Caleb Jackson has ever said, because you can get more miracles that way. But he's also become a good friend and one of the young guys coming up in the apologetics world online, or the theology geek world, and I'm so glad to see that. And he's meant a lot to my life. I'm having trouble today, man. He's been a lot to my life, and I think he'll mean a lot to yours if you'll give him a chance. Caleb, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Braxton.
And we'll see the rest of you next time on Trinity Radio.